There are no second acts in American lives, F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, but in old Hollywood, sometimes there were no first chances, just a parade of humiliations masquerading as auditions. How far would the studios go to mold a star, and what hopefuls had to endure just for a shot in the spotlight? Tonight, we step behind the screen tests and casting calls, where true stories reveal the business of dreams was built on something much darker than ambition. Judy Garland, forced to diet and strip for executives. Hollywood legends are often built on dazzling performances, but the story behind Judy Garland's very first MGM audition is pure nightmare fuel. Picture this. It's 1935, and a 13-year-old Frances Gumm, who'd later become the world's Judy Garland, stands under the harsh, unforgiving lights of a Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer soundstage. Studio moguls didn't want to see her talent first. They wanted to see her body. In a room full of powerful men, Judy was asked to strip down to her slip so the executives could inspect her potential. This wasn't a private moment or a medical necessity. This was routine. For a girl barely in her teens, with her mother quietly watching from the side, the whole thing was mortifying. But this was standard operating procedure for young hopefuls at the time. Judy had little choice but to comply. The humiliation didn't end there. MGM's top men lined up, taking notes as if they were cattle buyers at an auction. They immediately criticized her looks. Her nose was too flat, her teeth too crooked, her body too plump. These men saw her not as a person, but as a product to be molded. The cruelty was almost casual, a daily part of doing business for them. Within weeks of her first audition, the studio ordered Judy onto a punishing regimen. She was fed boiled chicken and black coffee, denied anything that might make her chubby. And it didn't stop with food. Studio doctors prescribed amphetamines to keep her thin, and then gave her sleeping pills at night so she'd get some rest. This cycle began before she'd even landed her first big role. If Judy rebelled, there were threats. "If you don't lose weight, there's always another girl," they'd tell her, implying she was disposable, a replaceable cog in the Hollywood machine. The experience set a precedent for the rest of Judy's life. Every audition, every screen test, every opportunity came with the understanding that her worth was tied to how she looked, not what she could do. She internalized that lesson, measuring herself against impossible standards set by strangers. The psychological scars from those early auditions would later feed into her addiction struggles, her anxiety, and ultimately, her tragic decline. Judy's story, often sugar-coated by Hollywood history, is a brutal reminder of just how far the industry went to crush young talent under impossible, inhuman standards, all in the name of making a star. Marilyn Monroe, the casting couch ritual. If there's a face synonymous with old Hollywood glamour, it's Marilyn Monroe. But behind the soft lighting and movie magazine smiles is a darker story about how she and so many other women were auditioned in the golden age. Before she was a star, Norma Jean Mortensen was just another pretty hopeful in a town that ran on exploitation. The so-called casting couch was more than a rumor. It was a system. Producers and directors routinely dangled parts in exchange for favors, and Monroe would later admit, bluntly, "I wasn't the only girl in Hollywood who had to sleep with a producer." One of the most harrowing examples came when a much older executive summoned her for a screen test, alone, after hours. The audition quickly shifted from reading lines to suggestive comments and then physical advances. Monroe was desperate for her break, but she also understood exactly what was happening. Her memoirs and interviews detail the internal conflict, the terror, the shame, the quiet anger at being reduced to a commodity. She was forced to make a choice that no one should ever have to make, and it didn't end with her. Monroe's stories echoed across the decades, exposing a system that preyed on the vulnerable. Even after she made it big, she spoke out, saying, "Hollywood is a place where they'll pay you $1,000 for a kiss and 50 cents for your soul." The system of auditioning actresses in hotel rooms or locked offices was normalized, with devastating consequences for generations. Marilyn's survival and eventual fame are nothing short of miraculous when you realize how many others were broken by the same ritual. Rita Hworth, screen test humiliation. Rita Hayworth's rise from shy Margarita Cancino to Hollywood's ultimate bombshell is the stuff of legend, but the journey was paved with humiliation at every step. When Rita first arrived at Columbia Pictures, she wasn't treated as a promising actress, but as a project to be reconstructed. Studio boss Harry Cohn and his staff didn't care about her raw talent or her years of dancing experience. Instead, they saw her heritage and natural looks as obstacles to overcome. They put her through a gauntlet of so-called screen tests that had little to do with performance. Rita was ordered to dye her naturally dark hair a bright auburn, erasing the Latin look that the studio thought wouldn't sell. Then came the physical pain. She had to undergo repeated, excruciating electrolysis sessions to painfully raise her hairline and reshape her appearance. The process didn't stop there. Rita was pushed to lose weight at any cost, given punishing diets, and told to slim down to fit a mold. But it was one notorious audition that left an especially deep scar. Hworth was made to perform in an absurdly tight, revealing outfit, paraded in front of a room packed with male executives. Every flaw was pointed out, every movement dissected and criticized. "You look too Spanish," they'd say dismissively, or "that nose will never photograph well." The pressure was relentless. Harry Cohn was infamous for parading young actresses before his board of directors, barking instructions, hurling insults, and reducing even the most talented to bundles of nerves. It was a circus, and Rita, like so many others, was the main attraction on display. Desperate for approval and painfully aware of how quickly a career could be snuffed out, Rita learned quickly that showing vulnerability was dangerous. She developed a public persona that hid her real self, a shield that allowed her to survive in a cutthroat industry. But the trauma of those early days never truly left her. Even at the height of her fame, after iconic roles in Gilda and CoverGirl, Rita confessed in interviews how she'd always felt like an outsider, never quite good enough, always performing for the approval of unseen, judgmental faces in the dark. Her career was built on a shaky foundation of self-doubt, planted by those humiliating so-called auditions. Hworth's transformation into a silver screen goddess was dramatic, but the price she paid, the pain, the shame, the constant scrutiny, was real and lasting. The Golden Age polished its stars to perfection, but sometimes it nearly destroyed them first. Natalie Wood, terrified during Rebel Without a Cause audition. Natalie Wood was barely 16 when she landed the fateful audition for Rebel Without a Cause, a film that would cement her place in Hollywood history, but at a heartbreaking personal cost. Natalie's mother, Maria, was the archetype of the ambitious stage mom, driven by dreams of fame and willing to sacrifice anything, especially her daughter's innocence, to make them come true. For Maria, the audition wasn't just a career opportunity, it was a test of how far Natalie was willing to go to please powerful men. "Do whatever it takes," she told Natalie, a phrase that would haunt her for years. The circumstances around the audition were steeped in Hollywood legend and whispered rumor. Director Nicholas Ray, a brilliant filmmaker but notorious for his predatory appetites, hosted his screen tests not on a studio lot, but late at night in his private bungalow at the Chateau Marmont. The air was thick with unspoken rules and blurred boundaries. According to accounts from those close to the production, Natalie's mother encouraged her to act older, to dress provocatively, and to be especially attentive to Ray's every word and gesture. There are stories of Ray offering Natalie alcohol, underage and nervous. She drank, hoping it would calm her nerves and please the director. The audition became a disturbing blend of performance and reality. Ray was reportedly mesmerized by Natalie's combination of innocence and raw, untamed emotion, a quality he wanted for the troubled Judy in his film. But instead of nurturing her talent, the process crossed lines that never should have been approached. Flirting was expected. Vulnerability was exploited. No one intervened, not her mother, not the studio, not the other adults on set. Natalie, desperate for approval and taught obedience from an early age, followed instructions without ever truly understanding the danger. Natalie got the part, and Rebel Without a Cause became a classic. But the price she paid was invisible and profound. In interviews as an adult, Natalie spoke about feeling haunted by those early experiences, describing the role as both a breakthrough and a wound. The scars of that audition, the emotional confusion, the sense of being used, would shape her relationships, her sense of self, and her lifelong struggle with trust. Hollywood celebrated the film, but the trauma endured by its young star remained a secret for decades, buried beneath the legend of teenage rebellion. Shirley Temple, locked in a soundproof box. Long before she became America's darling, Shirley Temple was just another wide-eyed hopeful, shuttled from audition to audition by a fiercely determined mother. Hollywood in the early 1930s was a place where dreams were both made and broken with alarming speed, especially for children, who were often seen less as people and more as pliable little products for the silver screen. One infamous Fox film screen test would set the bar for just how far studios were willing to go to find out what a kid was made of. The executives wanted to test the limits of their young actors' resilience, and what they devised for Shirley's audition was chilling even by the era's wild standards. On the day of her test, Shirley, no older than 5 or 6, was brought to a cavernous studio, supposedly to sing and dance as usual. But instead, the casting director explained they wanted to try something different. Without warning or explanation, Shirley was placed inside a pitch-black, soundproof booth. The door shut behind her with a solid thud, leaving her in complete darkness, cut off from all outside sound and comfort. No one told her how long she'd be in there, or if anyone was watching. Alone and terrified, Shirley fought the urge to cry. She later described thinking that the men outside were silently waiting for her to break down. Unbeknownst to her, the entire ordeal was an experiment designed to see if she could hold up under extreme stress and uncertainty. The goal wasn't to witness her talent. It was to test her composure. When the door finally opened and Shirley emerged, trembling and pale, the casting director praised her for not panicking and declared her perfect for the screen. What they didn't praise was the emotional toll, the kind that doesn't fade with applause or sunshine. Years later, Temple would recall that day with a shudder, admitting it was one of the few moments in Hollywood that truly scared her. She would go on to sing, dance, and light up Depression-era screens, but the lesson was clear. In Hollywood, even the smallest stars were fair games for cruel experiments. Shirley's story is a stark reminder that behind every cherubic grin and every twirling dance number, a little girl was fighting to survive in an industry that rarely cared about the cost of its own ambitions. Lana Turner, the sweater girl spectacle. Lana Turner's discovery at a Hollywood soda fountain is legend, but her real auditions in the golden age weren't about reading scripts. They were about being seen and judged. Once MGM scooped her up, Turner became the poster girl for the sweater girl phenomenon, and her earliest auditions cemented that status in the most degrading ways. Studio heads, publicists, and producers arranged so-called screen tests, where Lana would enter a room in a tight sweater and skirt, her every curve scrutinized by a room full of men. She was made to parade back and forth, turn, and even stand under harsh lighting, while executives whispered about her body, sometimes within earshot. These auditions weren't about acting talent. They were about spectacle. Turner's beauty was her ticket in, but it also became a trap. The leering gaze of Hollywood's decision-makers followed her everywhere. At one particularly infamous session, she was asked to pose in increasingly revealing outfits, pushing her comfort zone far beyond what she expected. "I felt like I was on display, not for a movie, but for their amusement," she once admitted to a close friend. The message was clear. Appearance was everything, and dissent could mean the end of a career before it began. Turner's experience set a pattern, not just for her own career, but for countless actresses after her. Every role, every audition, became a balancing act, offering just enough of herself to keep the studio interested, but never so much that she lost her sense of self entirely. The sweater girl label stuck with Lana for life, a reminder of those early, humiliating auditions that shaped and nearly broke one of Hollywood's most iconic stars, Peggy Ann Garner, forced to cry on command. If Hollywood wanted proof of a child actor's talent, it was all about the tears. For Peggy Ann Garner, one of 20th Century Fox's brightest young stars in the 1940s, the audition process was less about innocence and more like a psychological gauntlet. Studios didn't want to see if a child could recite lines. They wanted raw, immediate emotion, the kind that looked good in a tight close-up. Directors and casting agents didn't just encourage the waterworks, they demanded them. During one notorious audition, Garner was marched into a room filled with impatient adults, the air thick with expectation. There was no gentle coaxing. Instead, she was berated, scolded, and threatened, told that if she didn't produce real tears on the spot, she'd never work in Hollywood again. Some accounts claim she was deliberately kept separated from her mother, her sense of security chipped away until the only thing left was anxiety. It was a game of emotional brinkmanship, and everyone in the room seemed to be watching, waiting, and pushing until the dam finally broke. Once the tears flowed, the room would erupt in applause or approving laughter, as if the trauma was a performance to be celebrated, not a warning sign. Garner got the part, of course, but the emotional scars from those early auditions left a permanent mark. As an adult, she spoke candidly in interviews about the lasting damage. "I learned to cry on cue because they made me believe my whole future depended on it," Garner once recalled. "But nobody ever asked if I was okay when the cameras stopped." This cruelty wasn't unique to Garner. It was the industry standard for young actors during Hollywood's golden age. Studios saw children as malleable tools, easier to manipulate, quicker to recover, or so they told themselves. In reality, the pressure often led to lifelong anxiety, depression, and, in Peggy Ann Garner's case, a difficult and sometimes painful transition out of the spotlight. Her later years were marked by struggles to recapture her sense of self beyond the stage-managed tears of her childhood. The haunting reality is that, for some child stars, the price of fame was not just hard work and dedication. It was tears, forced out for the fleeting approval of strangers, leaving wounds that never truly healed. Jean Harlo, studio bosses crossing the line. Before platinum hair became her signature, Jean Harlo's entrance into Hollywood was marked by a series of auditions that blurred the line between performance and exploitation. The city's studio bosses, always on the hunt for the next it girl, treated every newcomer as a blank slate on which to project their fantasies, and Harlo, barely out of her teens, quickly found herself in the crosshairs of this relentless gaze. Her earliest auditions weren't simply about reading lines or conveying emotion. Instead, she was routinely told to prove her sex appeal, sometimes with scripts designed less to test talent than to manufacture desire. Studio casting agents would hand her overtly suggestive scenes, demanding she act out seductions or hold provocative poses far longer than any legitimate screen test required. Sometimes these scripts were simply pretexts for getting close. Agents would step in under the guise of coaching, physically adjusting her stance, posture, or even the fall of her dress, all while making lewd comments or exchanging knowing glances. Each time she complied, the power imbalance grew clearer. Harlo understood even then that saying no could mean the end of her Hollywood dream before it ever began. Her most humiliating test came when she was asked to don an extremely revealing dress and perform for a room packed with male executives, men who watched her every move, their attention lingering more on her body than on her delivery. No amount of preparation could protect her from the feeling of being appraised like an object, and the experience left her shaken and deeply self-conscious. Harlo would later admit, with a mix of wisdom and weariness, "You learn quickly that the audition isn't about you, it's about what they want to see." Despite the indignities, Harlo became an icon of the era, her image carefully constructed by the same men who had tested and humiliated her. The pain of those early auditions never fully faded, though. Friends would later say that beneath Jean's dazzling smile and devil-may-care persona was a sadness she rarely discussed, a lingering ache from being forced to prove her worth on terms set by others. Her rise to stardom is often celebrated as a triumph of charisma and beauty, but the truth behind her journey is a sobering reminder of what so many actresses endured just to be heard, seen, and remembered in old Hollywood. Susan Hayward, the slap test. Susan Hayward's reputation in Hollywood was built on grit, emotional power, and a willingness to dive deep into every role. But even by the rough standards of her era, one audition would haunt her for years. In the late 1930s, as producers and directors searched for the perfect Scarlett O'Hara for Gone with the Wind, competition was fierce, and the process grew ever more ruthless. For Hayward, just a young hopeful at the time, her big screen test was less about acting and more about surviving what would become known among actresses as the slap test. Instead of a straightforward audition, the director devised a cruel method to gauge Hayward's emotional authenticity. She was asked to perform a heated scene opposite a male actor. The instructions were simple and chilling. When the director gave his cue, the actor would slap her hard across the face. Not just once, but again and again, each blow more forceful, until Susan broke down in tears. The director justified this as a way to test her true emotional range, insisting that only by pushing an actress to her physical and psychological limits could he find the kind of pain and vulnerability needed for such an iconic role. Desperate to prove herself, Hayward endured the ordeal in silence, holding back tears until she simply couldn't anymore. The pain was real, her skin stung, and her dignity was battered. But what cut deeper was the realization that, in Hollywood, the suffering of actresses was often disguised as artistic necessity. After the audition ended, Susan collapsed backstage, weeping uncontrollably and requiring hours to compose herself. The memory of that day never truly left her. This kind of audition, what would now be called abuse, was not unusual in the Golden Age. Directors often pushed boundaries with impunity, believing that the end justified the means. For Hayward, the slap test became more than a bad memory. It was a lesson she'd later pass on to younger actresses who sought her advice. Always know your own limits, because Hollywood certainly won't set them for you. Her story, rarely told in the official histories, stands as a chilling reminder of what women in old Hollywood were forced to endure just for a chance at the spotlight, a sacrifice made of bruises, both visible and unseen. Ingred Bergman, Too Tall, Too Foreign, Abuse. Ingrid Bergman arrived in Hollywood in the late 1930s, carrying the glow of European prestige and a kind of natural, unforced beauty that set her apart from the meticulously styled studio stars of the era. But the moment she set foot on American soil, she realized that standing out could just as easily mean being pushed aside. Her earliest auditions for major studios were anything but welcoming. Producers and casting directors eyed her with suspicion, picking everything apart that made her unique. "You're too tall, too plain, too foreign," they'd bark, sometimes in front of a room full of other actresses, each silently grateful not to be the day's target. Instead of the usual lines or screen tests, Bergman was often subjected to what felt like a public shaming. Casting agents would have her stand at the front of the room, turning her this way and that, examining her like a mannequin on display. "Smile more," one would order. "Slouch, you're intimidating the leading men." They'd demand she repeat simple English phrases over and over, the words feeling more like tongue twisters as her voice began to crack from exhaustion and nerves. One infamous audition saw her forced to repeat the same sentence for nearly an hour, while the assembled executives snickered and criticized her Swedish accent, making jokes about her being too European for American audiences. The pressure to Americanize was relentless. She was encouraged to have dental work, to close the gap in her teeth, to dye her hair, even to change her posture and voice. Every difference was seen as a flaw to be corrected. "I felt like a circus animal," Bergman would later write in her memoirs, "trying to please an audience that only wanted to see me fail." The toll was not just professional, but deeply personal, as the confident actress who'd conquered Swedish cinema suddenly found herself doubting her worth. Despite the relentless criticism and the industry's attempts to reshape her, Bergman refused to give in completely. Her talent and dignity ultimately won out. She became not only a major Hollywood star, but a symbol of international glamour and authenticity. Still, the cruelty of those early auditions, the laughter, the derision, the feeling of being an outsider, never truly left her. Bergman's journey stands as proof that even the brightest stars had to first endure the darkness, learning to shine on their own terms before the rest of the world would finally applaud. Behind every legendary performance lies a story that rarely makes it to the spotlight, a story of sacrifice, pain, and survival. The golden age of Hollywood promised fame, but often demanded far too much from those desperate to belong. These auditions were more than just trials for a role. They were tests of spirit, dignity, and endurance. As the credits roll on old Hollywood's brightest stars, it's worth remembering the darkness they faced just to stand in the light.